Okay, so as I said before, the U.S. military, its doctrine, its way of thinking, is go straight after the enemy. Don't mess around. Go straight after the enemy. And in Europe, what this meant was a cross-channel invasion into France, and then from France, that would be the staging ground to invade an invasion of Germany. But the problem is how do you get troops into France now that Germany has occupied France, and that there will be Germans waiting for you on the French coast, knowing exactly what your plan is. It's a very complicated issue, and it takes a couple of years to solve. So, the other aspect of this, which is very important, is that US military leaders were absolutely convinced that it was essential to keep the Soviet Union in the war against the Germans. That if the Soviet Union were to collapse, were Stalin to make peace with Hitler, then that would be a disaster and it would be game over. That Hitler would win World War II. So, this is the other part of the thinking of US military leaders. They want to reassure the Soviets, they want to make sure that the Soviet Union stays in the war against Hitler. And US military leaders very, very firmly believe that the best way to keep the Soviet Union in the war against the Germans is to stage a cross-channel invasion and is to create a second front in Europe, where Hitler has to fight both the Soviet army, and in the East and in the West, Hitler has to fight the Allied army, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, the Poles, which of course was always Hitler's greatest nightmare, his greatest fear, having to fight a two-front war. So another aspect of US military thinking is we've got to keep the Soviet Union in the war. Now, uh, the Reese book talks about how there was some thinking or maybe some speculation that Stalin might have negotiated with Hitler. It's very unclear if that's true or not. But the real problem vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in 1942 was not Stalin negotiating with Hitler. It was that in 1942, the Soviets would just be defeated by Hitler. And we haven't gotten there yet in the course, but 1942 was the most dangerous year for the Soviet Union in terms of being defeated, at least since the initial invasion in June of 1941, the first months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. 1942 was a very, very critical year for the Soviet Union, and it looked awful for the Soviet Union, especially the summer of 1942. And it looked like Hitler, after gaining a second wind, after kind of regrouping after the winter of 1941, 1942, that in the summer of 1942, Hitler would once again threaten to defeat the Soviet Union. So the US military is not so much worried about Stalin surrendering to Hitler or negotiating with Hitler. They're worried that the Soviet army is just going to outright collapse in 1942 against the onslaught of the German army, and the Germans would win. So this is another thing that's very much on the minds of U.S. leaders in the early months in the summer of 1942. Now, when I'm talking about U.S. leaders, I'm talking about well, there's a lot of U.S. military, but I'm not going to drive you nuts having to remember them all. The person I'm going to focus on right now for this lecture is a man by the name of George Marshall, and I'll bring him up in another podcast. He's the commander in chief of the U.S. Army. Marshall was a very distinguished and I think really an excellent war leader. We were quite lucky to have him during World War II. He's from Virginia. Actually, he hadn't gone to West Point. I think he'd gone to the Citadel or something like that, but he rose up through the ranks of the Army. He was a very, he played an important role during World War One. He wasn't really a combat leader, but he was a staff officer, an administrator, or someone that made plans. Very, very experienced in terms of how the Army worked. He also knew Washington. He knew the politics of Washington. He knew how Washington worked. Um, he kind of kept FDR, the US president, at arm's length. He respected FDR, but at the same time, he didn't completely trust FDR. There's this very famous story where, uh, like in 1939, Roosevelt had promoted Marshall over dozens of higher-ranking U.S. generals to become head of the U.S. Army, um, because Roosevelt had a good eye for talent. He recognized that Marshall was the best person for the job. So of course Marshall appreciated that. But in one of their meetings after he was promoted, FDR called Marshall, he called him George. And Marshall didn't like to be called George. And he made it known that don't call me George. He didn't say it directly to Roosevelt's face, but he made it known, I don't like to be called George. And for the rest of the war, Roosevelt called him General Marshall. Roosevelt always tried to become familiar with his subordinates. So Marshall, like I say, he respects Roosevelt. He admires Roosevelt. Also, he is subordinate to Roosevelt. He recognizes the chain of command. He recognizes that in our system, the military answers to the civilian sector and not the other way around. But he's never, I would say, super close to Roosevelt as well, because he sees Roosevelt as kind of slippery and keeping all his options open, which Roosevelt, that's kind of the key to Roosevelt's success. So George Marshall, he's the person I want you to focus on for this lecture. He is head of he is the commander of the U.S. Army by the time Harbor happens in December of 1941, and I'll have more Marshall stand in for other military leaders as well. So Pearl Harbor happens, the US comes into the war, Hitler stupidly declares war on us on December 11th, 1941, and Roosevelt, Churchill, they breathe a sigh of relief. But now the question is what to do in Europe. Okay, the war has started, Hitler's declared war on us, Congress has declared war on Hitler, and so what do we do now? How do we defeat, what's the US role in defeating Hitler? Now, of course, the war in the Soviet Union is still happening, so let's not forget about that. But right now, we'll focus on U.S. strategy. Well, in March 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Marshall comes to Roosevelt with his game plan. Marshall presents to Roosevelt his game plan for defeating the Germans. And instead of rushing through this podcast, I'll go ahead and stop it and talk about what Marshall's plan in March of 1942, just 5 months after Pearl Harbor, is what Marshall proposes to Roosevelt.